thank you for joining us today for this Voices for Action webinar. My name is Brianna Salmon, and I'm the Executive Director here at GCC. So just some housekeeping to begin. Leif, if you could share the agenda slide. There we go. So part of the session is going to be recorded for future sharing. I'd love to invite you to use the chat to introduce yourself, to share where you're joining from, and the city and organization where you work. The presentation will be in English and closed captioning is available. All participants are muted and your video will be turned off. If you have any questions for our speakers today, feel free to submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And time permitting, we will try to answer these at the end of the webinar. So we're excited to be hosting some great panelists for an engaging discussion. We only have 60 minutes. Additional resources, reports, websites that are mentioned by our speakers will be shared in the chat, and also in a follow-up email they'll be sent to you after the webinar. After leaving the webinar, you'll have the option to complete a short survey, and we really appreciate your feedback as it helps us to inform future sessions. So first, I'd like to start us off in a good way today with an acknowledgement of the land that I'm on. So I'm located in Toronto, a word that's derived from Mohawk that means where the trees are standing in the water. Today, Toronto's covered under Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. It's the traditional territory of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a treaty where nations entered into an agreement to protect the land and responsibly care for its resources in harmony together. As settlers, newcomers, refugees, and Indigenous people, we have all been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I try and be very mindful of the broken treaties that persist across Turtle Island today, and to recognize our responsibilities as treaty people to engage in a meaningful, continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all of our relations. GCC is committed to advancing decolonization and anti-racism while centering the voices, leadership, and joy of Black, Indigenous, racialized, trans, and non-binary communities. While this work is underway, it is certainly never over. It is informed by our approach to internal processes, programming, philanthropic strategy, and the future we envision together. Today's session reflects our commitment to an equitable and just climate transition. Next slide, Leif. So we know that sustainable and climate-ready communities are needed, and we know that this need is urgent. For nearly 30 years, Green Communities Canada has been connecting and supporting community organizations across the country to accelerate climate action. We're deeply focused not just on why we should take climate action, but how. How do we make the momentous shifts that are needed in such a short period of time? How do we address the very real barriers that communities, and particularly marginalized communities, face to taking action? How do we ensure our work is intersectional and inclusive? And how do we make these shifts last? Our programs are diverse and always transforming, but our goal remains the same. Invest in building local capacity that's needed to accelerate ambitious climate solutions. Next slide. Today, we support more than, I would say we did a recent count, more than 100 organizations. And together we drive equitable and transformative change from coast to coast to coast. We do this by providing a network for organizations to share resources and knowledge, offering programs and services that organizations can roll out on the ground, and funding these organizations to lead this vital work. Next slide. GCC has 3 key programming areas. Our work at GCC focuses on sustainable mobility, residential energy efficiency, and green infrastructure. Green Communities Canada has been leading green infrastructure programs for more than a decade. Green infrastructure is one of many ways of leveraging nature-based solutions to address the dual challenges of both the climate crisis and the loss of natural habitats. When compared to some of the climate change solutions that often get a bit more attention in the news, like electric cars or carbon capture technologies, nature-based solutions are far more cost-effective and deliver broad and equitable benefits. In 2022, we launched Living Cities Canada, which aims to measurably accelerate the growth of nature-rich cities, increase community resilience, health, and vitality. Our Living Cities Canada Fund, which is part of our broader strategy, provides communities with direct financial support and a structured process to build capacity, leadership, and momentum for green infrastructure in communities. Since creating the fund, GCC has supported more than 100 green infrastructure projects in communities across the country. In 2024 alone, our projects restored nearly 30,000 square meters of urban land. No small feat, as urban projects, while critical, are often more resource intensive. Notably, over 70% of these projects were led or directly engaged equity deserving groups. Applications are currently open for the 2026 Demonstrate stream of our Living Cities Canada Fund, and we're looking forward to another Voices for Action event in early 2026 to share the impact of our 2025 projects. To apply for 2026 funding, please visit our website, and Saida is going to put the link in the chat. Before I pass it to Jared and our truly incredible panelists, I want to recognize some of the generous supporters of our 2025 and 2026 Living Cities Canada Fund, Definity Insurance Corporation, RBC Foundation, Heart Lake Foundation, and several other private philanthropic foundations. I also want to do a big shout out to Trees for Life for joining us as a delivery partner in 2025. Now, I'm pleased to hand it off to our host for today, Jared, GCC's Managing Director, to introduce our amazing panelists. Off to you, Jared.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Brianna. As we move into the discussion, I wanted to frame up where we're going today and describe a bit of the state of play right now across this country. Nearly 30 million Canadians, three-quarters of our population, live in major metropolitan centers. And in just the past 5 years, these urban communities have experienced the impacts of climate change firsthand, and in many cases for the first time. You can see here, the ultimately, giga-fires and that was a new word for me, giga-fire. I've spent a lot of time thinking about wildfires, but giga-fires, and this is, of course, a million square hectares of land mass and wildfire smoke that created the worst air quality in the world in August of 2025 and in previous years. Next slide. Extreme heat events, including the 2021 heat dome in BC that caused 619 heat-related deaths, making this the deadliest weather event in Canadian history. Next slide. Devastating flooding, like we've seen in Toronto now many times in recent years and elsewhere across Canada, and so much more. In addition to the human toll, if you can go to the next slide, the Canadian insurance industry has summed up the rising scale of these changes in terms of financial damage. In the 25 years before 2008, the average annual catastrophic weather event payouts were roughly $400 million per year. In the first 10 years of the millennia, from 2000 to 2010, Canadian insurers averaged 701 million a year in losses related to severe weather. That continued to accelerate and has continued to. In 2023, that number quadrupled to $3 billion, and then more than doubled again last year in 2024 to $8 billion. The climate crisis is affecting our lives now and will continue to worsen for years to come. Next slide, please. The questions we face are not only about mitigation and mitigation to create a sustainable future, but also about how we invest in adaptation and build resilience for the tough times ahead. At the same time, communities are also dealing with housing, affordability, and a crisis of inequality. The challenges to fixing all of this are real, but the most impactful solutions are also real and local. We're not talking about those solutions enough and how urban communities are poised to be leaders in the transformations that can benefit the majority of Canadians. So let's jump into solutions. Green infrastructure and nature-based solutions like mini forests, rain gardens, and urban parks can help cities adapt and thrive. These local solutions can reduce heat island effects, as shown here in a thermal image done during a heat wave in Melbourne, Australia. Rain gardens and strategically planned green infrastructure can mitigate flooding from extreme rainfall events, as seen here in Vancouver with the example of the St. George Rainway. And we'll talk about a few other examples today as well on that particular note. And as Brianna pointed out, GCC has been advancing these solutions at the community level for many years. Climate change is going to keep exacerbating inequities and supercharging our weather. Canadians need more than a few mega project investments to meet these challenges. Real transformation starts at the community level by activating the communities that stand to benefit most by creating thousands of mini green solutions like mini forests, rain gardens, urban parks, and so on to make cities more livable, equitable, and resilient. Together today, we're here to explore how local green infrastructure and other mighty mini solutions can transform Canada's urban communities one project at a time. I'm pleased now to introduce our panelists who've graciously dedicated some time this morning to join us. And I'll just spend a moment and read everyone's a little bit about everybody, and then we'll hand it over for some in-person introductions. John Still is a senior manager, restoration projects at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. Eileen Davila is the former medical officer of health at the City of Toronto and is an adjunct professor and senior fellow at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Amanda O'Rourke is executive director at 880 Cities. Joyce Chow is program director at Evergreen. And Aaron Barter is vice president, program integration and sustainability at Waterfront Toronto. We're talking urban challenges and we're talking solutions today. But as an introduction to the discussion, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to tell us a little about the backgrounds that they're coming from. Eileen, I've got you in my top left right now, so I'll go to you first.
Well, thank you, Jared. And what a pleasure it is to be here as part of this, august panel and having this really important conversation. So how do I come at this issue? Well, I come at it as a public health professional, albeit recently retired from the most active component of my career, but still very much concerned and still very much involved in public health solutions. So clearly, the kinds of events, the issues that you just described now through the slides, whether we're talking about wildfires, whether we're talking about heat domes, cold snaps, flooding, this all has impact ultimately on the people who live in the various communities that are impacted by these climate change related events. So, from a public health perspective, where we're always looking at things from a preventative point of view and a population level perspective, the issue is how do we prevent these things from happening in the first place? And as well, what can we do um, as public health professionals in concert and in partnership with communities and with decision makers, particularly elected officials, to actually mitigate the negative health impact of these events if we can't prevent them in the first place? So those are just some opening thoughts, and I'll hand it over to others.
That's great. Thanks so much, Eileen. John, I'm going to go to you next to offer up your perspective on where you're coming from to this discussion.
Great. Thanks, Jared. And my thanks to the Green Communities Canada for having me and hosting this important event. I've been a part of TRCA for 23 years, involved in ecosystem restoration across our jurisdiction within the watersheds and along the waterfront. We work closely with municipalities, NGOs, federal and provincial agencies, private landowners, community groups, farmers, Indigenous communities, all to identify, prioritize, plan, design, and implement and monitor ecosystem restoration projects across the GTA. And there's obviously a strong overlap, and green infrastructure can be defined a few ways, but this is all important natural system green infrastructure that contributes to resiliency and benefiting communities as we're faced with urban pressures, urban growth, and which is exacerbated by climate change. We typically we're involved in identifying often human-made alterations to the landscape that are causing natural area loss and impairments to ecosystem function, and we work with all these agencies to reverse that alteration. Restoration is bringing back a lost function or lost feature to some historical condition, and that's what we work to do, like a drained wetland to accommodate agriculture, or a straightened or altered water course or concrete lined water course to accommodate development and growth. These things are reaching their life expectancy. They're also undersized, they're eroding and causing flooding. And we find sort of natural solutions for that. That's ecosystem restoration, it's green infrastructure, low impact development, incorporating best management practices across that landscape. And that's a big focus of what we do. And we leverage all these agencies and interested parties to get together and collaborate and prioritize where to restore, and how to get the biggest gain when restoring these impaired features.
Amazing. Thanks so much, John. Joyce, Evergreen has had a front row seat to some significant flood events in the last several years. Do you want to tell us about where you're coming from today?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me here. I see a lot of familiar names in the chat, so I feel like this is a warm and friendly crowd. Hi, everyone. My name is Joyce Chow. I go by she, her pronouns. As Jared mentioned, I'm a program director at Evergreen. Right now, I'm joining you from Treaty 13 at the Evergreen Brickworks, our head office, located within a floodplain, the Don Valley Ravine. And that picture that was shown of the flood in 2024 in July, that's sort of right next door to our offices. So yeah, I was on site that day. So the lens that I'm bringing is the importance of these mighty mini solutions when you're in a context of being in a floodplain, a post-industrial site, and a place that is beloved from many people from across the community and beyond, and bringing these three things together for a powerful impact. So Evergreen first started as a tree planting organization, a charity, to bring nature back into the city. One of the really early groups in this endeavor. And then over the years, the organization has grown and matured into really bringing resiliency into communities across the country. So our laser focus right now is to proliferate better public spaces like parks, public spaces like our school grounds, daycares. And when we say better public spaces, what we mean are places that are climate resilient, places that connect people and especially kids to nature, places that contribute to health and well-being, and places that strengthen communities. And so this is the bulk of my portfolio at Evergreen, is how do you help communities bring about these better public spaces across the country, and how do we overcome the multitude of barriers, and there are so many, to getting these kinds of projects off the ground, large and small. Like the barriers are quite the same. So that's the perspective I'm bringing to this conversation.
Amazing. Thanks, Joyce. Aaron, you're also bringing in part a site-based element to the conversation, and you're coming, of course, from Waterfront Toronto. I want to hand it over to you. Tell us a little more.
Yeah, well, that's right. We're just down the Don River from Joyce at Evergreen. So good morning, everyone. Thanks to the GCC team for having us. As Jared said, my name's Aaron, and I'm joining today from the shore of Lake Ontario. It's just in front of me, outside the window. It's great to see you all. Like Brianna said, and Joyce, I'm joining from Treaty 13, the traditional territory of Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat, and other diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And I like how, Brianna, you mentioned Tikarano, where the trees are in the water, because here on the waterfront, we just created a new island called Aquaman-Minising. I encourage us all to start learning these names, which means place of the black cherries trees in Anishinaabe, Moan, and Ojibwe Moan. And more on that in a few minutes. For context, Waterfront Toronto is the government revitalization lead on Toronto's Lake Ontario lakefront. We're a nonprofit corporation with shareholders from the City of Toronto, from the Province of Ontario, and from the Government of Canada. So we're a tri-government, multi-limbed creature that is trying to make things happen on the waterfront. We were founded in 2001, and so for 25 years, we've been working with this emphasis on climate resilient infrastructure. We also are very active in the delivery of parks and public realm, and happy to elaborate on that, and also affordable housing. So happy to be here and look forward to the discussion with this panel.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Aaron. Last but not least, Amanda from 880 Cities. Over to you, Amanda, to contextualize where you're coming from today.
Thanks, Jared, and thanks everyone. It's really lovely to be here and share the space with you all. I'm also joining from Treaty 13, Toronto, and as Jared mentioned, I'm the executive director of 880 Cities. If you're not familiar with 880 Cities, we are a nonprofit organization that is based in Toronto, but we work internationally. So we come with a lens also of thinking locally, but also learning from abroad and taking some of the best ideas globally and trying to apply them and those solutions locally as well. We are based on our organization is based on this very simple but powerful question that we often ask, which is, what if everything we did in our cities was great for an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old? We believe if you start there, you can open up a really dynamic and wonderful conversation on how we design, plan, and manage our cities, thinking about people, thinking about our connection to the land and each other. And so that's really what 880 Cities is about. I have the privilege of leading a very multidisciplinary team of urban planners, urban designers, community engagement specialists, and as you really laid out in your opening, we know that cities are very much on the front lines of these intersecting crises of climate change and health. And I'm so glad that Dr. Villa is here too, because this is really uh, the focus of our kind of attention and how we rethink and reimagine all the public spaces as actually spaces that can promote health and well-being and connection to nature. So that's really the lens I'm bringing today, thinking about how we actually use all that we have, all the assets in our communities as leverage points for all those many, many solutions that we're going to talk about today.
That's great. Thanks so much, Amanda. I appreciate that. And I love that provocation continuously in the back of the mind, thinking about how to make a city that's great for an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old and where we go from there. With all that said, where we go here is we're all working on related but somewhat, unique challenges coming from the fields that we work in. And to move into the next section of the discussion, really like to hear about, one or two challenges that, you've been working on and really trying to solve, or, part of what your part of, the industry is trying to solve, what your background, what your field. We each have had some unique challenges over the last several years, of course, coming out of the pandemic. And now here we are in late 2025. And these challenges, of course, range in size, degree scale. But I, want to hand it off. We started with Eileen before, and we'll go in the reverse order. Amanda, do you want to say a little bit about one of those challenges or two of the challenges that you've been working on?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the big challenges is really that we know that more people are living cities. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's, a good thing. That's good for sustainability. But we also know that more people are living unhealthier in cities and less connected to nature. And these crises are having real impacts on not only people's health, but planetary health. And so one of the projects that I wanted to share that we've been working on is a project called 880 Tower Pops. So we also know that access to quality green space and social space is inequitably distributed in our cities, and not everyone. And the pandemic really highlighted this. Folks who were living in large towers, often in tower neighborhoods that were lacking access to green space. They didn't have front yards and backyards to be able to get some fresh air, exercise, access to sunlight, all the things that we know make people feel better and healthier. And so our project called 880 Tower Pops is really trying to this challenge of inequitable distribution of quality green space and social spaces in these neighborhoods. No surprise, these neighborhoods, these tower neighborhoods are often also have a higher proportion of equity deserving communities. So a higher proportion of newcomers to Canada. This project is happening, sorry, in Toronto and Mississauga that we're doing. They are a higher proportion of equity deserving communities. They are also often on floodplains. So we're really trying to activate the underused spaces in close proximity to these tower neighborhoods, reimagining the spaces like in Cooksville, Mississauga. We're reimagining and transforming a parking lot into a space for social connection, active play, nature-based solutions, including planting and community gardens. In Toronto, we're activating those spaces in between those Toronto community housing buildings that are often just patches of grass as a space for social connection, community gardens, a harvest table for sharing meals. So this is, I think, a great example of placemaking at work through community connection and co-design, and the kinds of solutions that we need to bring where we're actually going to where people are, like in their daily lives, and making it real to them and making climate solutions real to them in their everyday experiences.
That's amazing. Yeah, thank you, Amanda. One thing we have talked about is the invitation into public space, and a feeling of exclusion that sometimes arises for many folks in our communities. Joyce, I wanted to go to you next and just get a sense of some of the challenges that you've been working on, and as a jump off point for where we go next and thinking about some of the solutions, but to zero in on some of the challenges that you've been working on.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that the Evergreen Brickworks is located in a floodplain and is a post-industrial site. So figuring out how to revitalize the space in a way that feels inclusive for community is really important for us. It's at the heart of what we do, and also to bring joy back into communities. The Community Foundation support, including the one from the Toronto Foundation, is telling us that people are lonely. People need that social connection. We saw how important it was during the pandemic, and we saw how important outdoor spaces was to stay sane, to not be locked up at home. And so the work that we do is really trying to bring joy back into the city, trying to make space for people to connect with one another, to have these micro connections, to be able to communicate with one another. And the work that we do in public space provides that platform and invitation. And it's not just the building of better public spaces like some of the pollinator gardens we have on site or the food forest. It's how we go about doing it. And the how is as important as the what. And so what I mean by that is that the work that we do, we always try to, we say it's for community by community. So what is the community vision of what they want in that space? How would they use it? Is it someplace that they'll want to go in their spare time and spend time with family and friends? Is it a place where they want to linger? And so I say the special sauce that we bring to these projects is that, yes, these are nature-based solutions, many, not so many, large, all the scales. But it's a place where it can multi-solve. And so not only do we have green infrastructure on site and gardens for birds and other pollinators and a food forest on site, these are interventions that weave in public art, that weave in opportunities for learning and education. So it brings all these things together so that we become efficient in a way on how we can bring people together, that it's not just one identity. A project is not one thing. It's many things at the same time to solve for these many problems that are facing our communities writ large.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Joyce. Aaron, you've been, part of the team at Waterfront Toronto for a bit of time, and I know you've been working hard on the aquaminising project and solving for a number of challenges. I'd like to go to you next to talk a little more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, this is primarily a project that originally was intended as a flood protection project, and indeed, earlier this year we completed the flood protection required to unlock development and proceed with revitalization across the area. But I wanted to also latch on to something that Joyce was mentioning around the co-benefits and the idea that by making this substantial government investment in a climate resilience project and a flood mitigation project, we can actually unlock all of these attached benefits, whether that be through new public space, new parks, playgrounds, aquatic habitat, and terrestrial habitat for animals. Again, kind of thinking beyond this idea that cities are for people, but even thinking about all of the other species that are here and were here a long time before we were. So all of those co-benefits I think are important to recognize, especially as we approach these mega projects. Admittedly, very different from what I think some of my other panelists have worked on or are activating, where it's these really very precise kind of community focused or interventions. This is a large project. It's $1.3 billion, tri-government funded. There's all of these tangible benefits that come with it beyond that core purpose, which is to prevent flooding from happening within big parts of the eastern waterfront in Toronto. So that the challenge we're facing is flooding. The solution that we see is around naturalization and finding ways to work with nature and manage floodwaters in a natural way, rather than boxing in and creating hard channels and what we know is essentially ineffective in a changing climate. I also wanted to just mention something that I think it is important as we look at these larger scale projects, which is that it takes decades and decades of hard work at a grassroots level to make these ideas palatable for all the funders. And there's a history of engagement and grassroots organizing that very much lay the foundation for what we're doing today on Toronto's waterfront. Goes all the way back to 1969 when there was actually a mock funeral held. Shout out to Pollution Probe, who may be on the call, who launched this active, essentially an art performance of the funeral of the Don River, which of course had suffered from decades of pollution, industrialization, and neglect. And from there, it took 20 years for the city council to launch a task force, which issued a report in 1991 that argued for creating a natural mouth of the Don River, which had been lost when Ashbridges Bay was filled in to create the portlands for industry. And then fast forward to just last month, we helped an event called the Don River Awakens, where essentially we've brought it back to life. It's taken 40, 50 years to go from a condition of neglect and industrialization to now an active flood protection landform and climate resilience project, but also a real living and thriving river, which we're very excited about. And that was a community procession that happened just last month to kind of celebrate coming back to life. So we think the challenges are huge, but there are also very creative solutions, and they take a long time to bring these from fruition, from that grassroots organizing into the fruition we see now.
It's amazing, Aaron. What a great story, and amazing to contextualize it in that way. And the role that community organizing and engagement at a grassroots level plays in, moving the needle on some of these issues. I'm going to turn to Dr. Davila next, and Eileen, I'd love to understand a little more some of the challenges that you're seeing, in the world of public health and how that intersects in on the issues that we're talking about today.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. I mean, it is absolutely fascinating to hear everybody's stories for sure. And if I can relate public health to those, whether it's an 880 or an evergreen or a waterfront Toronto, doing these initiatives, placemaking, developing different projects and revitalizing, specific areas. I think one of the areas that public health has been most helpful with in the past is in providing support or influencing the decision-making process by bringing the public health science or evidence to the fore and explaining how the interventions actually are a worthwhile investment when we are thinking about human health, community health, and yes, indeed, sort of planetary health on the largest level, because these are all interrelated. But demonstrating that there's value to doing these from a health and well-being perspective, using the available evidence has traditionally been one of the areas where public health has been able to influence and support. And in the past, I would say that the challenge was actually finding good evidence, encouraging researchers to actually study the stuff so that we would have the evidence to support and influence the kinds of activities that we're talking about today. The really interesting part, and I would argue unfortunate part in the last few years, particularly as we've been emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic and the response, is that there has been a lot of politicization around science, and including, and I would say especially, public health science. So the interesting thing, and I think the question that's before us now, is that if public health is to continue to play this important supportive and influencing role in getting the policy decisions, in getting the kinds of investments that we need to see, how does one do that when the very science, our role, is increasingly questioned and in some cases, particularly south of the border, under attack? And so that, I think, is one of the very germane challenges. How do we continue to support as public health, the kinds of initiatives that we're talking about here, recognizing that we're in the context where, frankly, the public health science is just very much, at the very least, questioned, and in some cases, under outright attack.
I'd like to invite, of course, panelists to be able to jump in on that and discuss. But before we do that, I want to not forget about John. And John, I am curious about, you're, of course, coming from the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. And of course, this is also a model that has been under attack. I'm not looking for you to necessarily comment on that, but I also want to make sure to point that out. That being said, what are some of the challenges that, you've been working on and how that intersects here?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear from the great panel discussion here that green space is where a lot of this intersects. That they're as cities build, they put they're squeezing green space, they're infrastructure through green space, they're tightening up water courses with hardened channels, they're disconnecting those channels from the floodplain, removing wetlands, anything that's sort of an inconvenience for development. Old infrastructure practices, wants to shoot water as fast as possible away from communities. But right now, that's all, in many cases undersized, and cities have to deal with the fact that they're undersized, old infrastructure is failing, and that's causing significant flooding, significant erosion, and that's impacting the communities, like not just their houses, but because these are often in parkland spaces, it's impacting trails, and it's impacting playgrounds, it's impacting people's ability to enjoy nature and get behind these kind of initiatives, like be inspired and motivated as well. So example, and so that's a huge challenge, and we work with municipalities on this regularly because and politicians, because the communities are asking for this. They don't want to lose their backyard, or they're tired of the trail getting flooded out. And these are all, in many cases can be solved with nature-based solutions if we've got a bit of room and to work with. So, our projects, so I'll just give an example of a natural channel project in Brampton where, they have an eco park strategy. We have a natural channel sort of restoration program, and we can intersect those things. So we can we pull out these failing concrete light channels, we restore a natural meandering channel with associated wetlands, we dig out so we can reconnect these watercourses to their floodplains, we create wetlands that intercept untreated stormwater outlets that go into these valleys because that's where they got pumped to. But then with the eco park example, we can integrate and upgrade trails. We incorporate lookouts into shorelines or watercourses or wetlands, so people have a place to go and enjoy the wetland without sort of trampling everywhere. So we can sort of control people's experience, but also give them a better experience. We can connect other health. There's exercise stations, playgrounds. We've built mini theaters and labs and science labs for schools, and so they're a great way to integrate everything in a nature-based way that gets at that idea of climate change and increased flooding and erosion and old infrastructure that can't handle it. I live in a neighborhood that got flooded out with those storm events. We're now fixing up a section of Mud Creek that actually spilled into the brickworks that Joyce, I'm sure, is aware of. That was part of that big storm event. Of course, the Lower Don is a huge project that's going to provide just an insane amount of benefit. So that's a huge challenge. And these are, I'll just touch on another one. Land use. Rethinking land use. We have a project called the Meadowway in the city of Toronto, which is a 17-kilometer expanse of hydro corridor that was just turf grass, and so we've converted that into a natural meadow. We've done a whole trail system, 17-kilometer trail system that runs through that meadow. It's completely transformed the site from just barren, low biodiversity landscape to a thriving meadow site that people can walk and enjoy and just get inspired by. And there's all sorts of climate change mitigation benefits from deep root structures from those plants and temperature mitigation, and so there's all sorts of benefits tied to that. So integrating nature-based solutions is one very strong tool that can get at everything we're talking about here, because that's where this all sort of intersects in our view. So and and just the last sort of challenge, I think, is there's many projects, there's large projects, but funding is a huge one. We've got a lot of unmet needs. We've got areas we want to do restoration in, and there's not always the funding available. So partnerships are gigantic for achieving these kind of deliverables or benefits. So multi-agency, NGOs, community groups, politicians, all rallying behind this effort is it's greatly needed and is growing and growing and growing, and we see that with the partnerships that get forged, or even people reaching out. And so there's all sorts of momentum around that, but leveraging our own momentum with other agencies and their own momentum is critical to achieving all this.
Appreciate that, John. And those are some big challenges that you're talking about, and appreciate you ending that note on the role of partnerships. I want to, before asking any particular questions, I want to just go back to the panel as a whole and responses to some of the challenges that other panelists may have brought up and that you may have either worked on or want to build upon. And so please jump on in.
Well, I would love to build on what John was saying around the green infrastructure and all the panelists were talking about, which I think is so important. And sometimes I think we don't remember to pair it with the social infrastructure and how much it's important for them to be interconnected. So as these communities as our communities are facing more climate-related extreme events, we also know that the impacts are exacerbated by the fact that there's not the social infrastructure. We know about, the heat waves in New York and Paris, where the stories around many of the folks that died in those heat waves were older adults who were socially isolated in their homes and they didn't have a neighbor to come and check on them. So I just wanted to sort of build on that theme because I think it's very important funding around the physical infrastructure, but often we are underfunding the social infrastructure to make that physical infrastructure have all those incredible co-benefits that my other panelists spoke about.
And Amanda, if I can add to that, I would say that the the evidence and the studies and the science that's needed to support that is also under attack. And so that's where it gets more and more challenging. And it's important for us to figure how we work together and how we meet decision makers and our public where they're at, knowing that this is the context within which we're operating. So for me, one of the things that I've often been reflecting on is how do we as public health continue to be true to the science, but also recognize that, there are times when you go a little bit faster and you can press a little bit harder with that evidence, and other times when in fact we have to, take a bit more of a back seat, recognizing that people frankly, are still processing and recovering from the pandemic response and all that it took from us. Um, and we ease a little bit on the how much do people want to hear from public health, and how much do they need to hear it from different sides or different parts of community and society.
Aaron, looks like you want to jump in.
Absolutely. Although I think it's very difficult to follow up that point from Dr. Davila. I feel like we all owe you a lot of gratitude for your leadership, as a side note, during the pandemic. But I was going to touch on a different point, which was around some of in the notes in the chat around the cost benefit analysis. And as we think about the benefits of a project, sometimes I think an important point for us to remember as practitioners in sustainability and green infrastructure is that sometimes the hook to get a project moving forward may not be what we think it is, because there's this wide range of benefits, it can actually be helpful to think about what we might consider to be a co-benefit might be the core benefit to a funder. And as you reverse that and think about it as a different type of project, you can ensure that your work on green infrastructure will go forward and that they will indeed be all of the same outcomes from the project, but how those are characterized is somewhat malleable, right? Depending on the audience. So I would encourage, as people are trying to move projects forward, think about, is it flooding? Is it urban heat? Is it public health? Is it housing enablement, right? Which is a big topic these days, right? Enabling infrastructure. And then you can tie it all together, but it may not be the hook that you think, depending on the audience.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Aaron, quite a bit. I want to just add in, I've been reflecting on my experience so far in Badasagate Park in the Portlands, and I've been thinking about this. Spoiler alert, I once upon a time worked for 880 Cities, and I've worked with Amanda in the past, but one of those core principles of any great place that we're creating, abide by the rule of 10, in that there are 10 things to do in a great place. And I look at Badasagay and I think of that as like there is truly like has become a place and of some significance from the past and into the future. And in thinking about that rule of 10, it reminds me of something that Eileen has brought up in the past as well, which is the crisis of loneliness, and that many of our public spaces lack a certain level of engagement, which goes to something that Amanda and Joyce, you both commented on as well. A lack of, invitation into public spaces, and the role that creating really great places plays going forward and addressing a lack of connection within our communities.
If I can chime in on that, I think that's a really important point. Like that's the visual. It's also like the visual outcome. Like it's hard to characterize or even discuss the benefits or have people understand some of the benefits sometimes. And we try to do research and science around showing, how wetlands can absorb, major storm events and treat water quality and all that kind of thing. And sometimes that always goes to what's the monetary comparison to that, which can be a challenge and can be, disputed. And, I'm sure, I don't know the health world, but I'm sure it's a very similar kind of critique that, translating that all into an economic thing can be a challenge. So, things like completed park systems and Lower Dawn is a great way to show that. Like, it's such a meaningful thing to see. But all of it's important, but it is a challenge to communicate that. But you see something like the Lower Dawn, and things seem to crystallize. I think that's a really, really good thing.
I can jump in and share that it's not a mini intervention, it's more of a larger scale. We did a full school ground transformation with the Colson Public School in the Halton District School Board in Milton. And this was the Canada's first climate ready school. And so as part of that pilot project, we did really invest in the measurement and evaluation of that, and found that after all the interventions to bring in native biodiversity, to address some of the flooding issues, to create spaces for children to learn and play with outdoor classrooms. We found that there was a triple bottom line analysis conducted that looked at benefits to climate resiliency, community, and well-being. And we found that for every dollar invested in the project, we got back $2.10. I think this could increase, but we found that exercise very helpful to be able to share the multitude of benefits, and yes, Erin, as you're saying, you need to find the right story for the right funder or supporter. But we also found that through this kind of change, like the principal said that she was seeing less students in the principal's office. There were less fights happening. Parents were dropping off their kids and staying and chatting with other parents in the space, or they're going back to the space on the weekends. And other schools were taking field trips to that school. So I just wanted to speak to how important it is to do different kinds of evaluations on the projects. And then I think what I really want to share is that because these can have such a joyful impact, doing these, we do a lot of work in school grounds. And so elevating the expectations of what our public spaces and school grounds can look like, I think is really important to know how we want to see our future. And ingraining this in our children, I think, is one of the best ways of doing that.
I love that, Joyce. Really, really fantastic illustration, I think, of what's possible there. Thanks so much for sharing that. I have one question that came in through the chat that I wanted to toss to the group, and that's nature as a prescription. And it's a growing practice where healthcare professionals formally recommend spending time in nature to improve patient health and treating it as a complementary part of traditional medical care. Question about how can we scale that model?
Sorry, I might have something to say on that. It just took me an extra second to unmute. Again, individual health and healthcare, not my area of expertise, but certainly there's no question that having it built into it, it's sort of by having healthcare providers actually vouch for and prescribe exposure to nature as good for your health, it gives it that extra little bit of credence, and I think may encourage people to do that. I think what's really important, though, from a sort of a policy perspective and from a public health perspective, is how do we actually make it easier, or again, if I can use Joyce's language, how do we elevate our expectations such that access to green space becomes part of just how we do things? That you would never imagine a community that did not have access and equitable access to green space. And that fits really nicely, if you ask me, with a public health perspective and philosophy. Because one way to look at public health is it's about changing what's socially acceptable. So back in the early 1900s, it was considered just routine and the way things were that, young children would, a large proportion of young children would die before the age of 5 because of infectious diseases. And over time, thanks to things like clean water, better nutrition, access to antibiotics, vaccines. Yes, even though they are debated by some, vaccines, these are the kinds of things that actually made a difference. They changed, they elevated expectations and, for the better, brought us all better health. I think we've all had conversations, and those of us of a certain vintage will remember that communities, smoking was routine, in restaurants, in enclosed public spaces. Again, with a different mindset and with policy changes, that's now no longer in keeping with expectations. And I think one of the common threads that we share as panelists, and I would say as the participants on this call, is that actually we do have an opportunity to work together to understand the different benefits, the different funders, the different ways of looking at the kinds of initiatives that we're talking about here to advance them so that we begin to really elevate expectations. Joyce, I'm going to borrow your words and I'm using them from here on in. How do we actually work together to elevate those expectations and change the environment for the better, whether it's around, physical health, mental health, social health, well-being, environmental health, planetary health, all of the above? I think it's really where the power and the optimism is.
I want to jump in. I love that, and just want to sort of agree that sort of changing the status quo is like the biggest effort that we all can make, I think, and changing what's kind of normal. I heard a recent statistic that Canadians on average spend about 90% of our time indoors. And that has become so normalized. And it wasn't always the way. And there's been in the last 100 years, there's been a real steep decline in how much time we spend outside in nature. There was a recent Guardian article about that too. And so to me, it's also not surprising that we are like the loneliest we've ever been, and also as disconnected to the land and not making good decisions about the planetary health because we don't have that sense of normal connection and everyday connection to the land and each other. I think a big part of what 880 Cities tries to do, as well as folks here on this panel, is again making it normal again and easy, making that healthy choice the easy choice, making it a joyful choice to Joyce's message as well. Like we have to really not just be climate adaptive. We have to be all resistance. We have to have resistance to the status quo and create new conditions for people to really feel invited and also feel that they can have power. I think, but one of our biggest challenges is in communities, the sense of powerlessness that they have to addressing these large crises around climate change and the health crisis. But the more that we bring it sort of on the ground level and something really tangible that people can do themselves, whether it's recently at Tower Pops, a resident in the tower hosted a folk dancing night because all of a sudden the conditions in that parking lot had changed in a way that he felt, oh, I can actually organize my community and do movement and cultural celebration in the space. We have communities organizing social clubs in this space. So it doesn't take a lot. I mean, it takes a lot everywhere, but it doesn't take a lot to actually change those conditions. And that's why I love sort of the focus of this panel is on the many, many solutions, because many, many solutions takes many hands and hearts. Like this is like soul work. We have to like start connect with people here. And then I think the evidence flows from that, but I think it starts with feeling.
Amazing. Amazing. Thanks, Amanda. That's a good note, I think, to end on. I want to reveal to everyone on the call and who's tuning in today, GCC's commissioned a short mini documentary series interviewing each of our panelists on this call today, which should be out in the new year. So watch for that. I want to extend a really warm and heartfelt thank you to each of our panelists, Erin, Eileen, Joyce, Amanda, and John, for spending the hour with us here. I think each of you have offered a really important and unique perspective on this issue. And thanks to all of our guests who joined us today for our Voices for Action, and we'll be looking to a brand new year in 2026 and a whole new schedule of events. So stay in touch, and we'll be back to you soon. Thanks once again, everybody, for joining us.